Today, we will be looking at development policy, social policy and administration. That is BED 4132. My name is John Kenywa from the School of Social Sciences and the Department of Social and Development Studies. In today's session or lesson, we'll be looking at this unit, the framework or the layout for this unit, what it aims to achieve in terms of the learning, in terms of the objective, the learning outcomes that would be expected for one to be able to, the learning outcomes that a student will be expected to demonstrate once they have been able to go through this unit. And then you'll be looking at how the sessions for this unit have been laid out in a name to make sure that you're able to achieve the learning objective and the learning outcomes for the unit. So to begin with, you look at what is the main objective of this unit. And the objective here is that this unit we aim to help student understand the logical and causal connections between social policy, social work, administration, and welfare. This unit will give the student an opportunity of being aware of the social policy models that exist in the market or out there that they can be able to leverage on in the contemporary world, the social policy model that exists in the contemporary world, and the main characteristics and peculiarities or the uniqueness of social work services and delivery that we have. This unit will also help students, or will help you when you go through it, to acquire knowledge on the mutual influence between social policy and administration. Now, when you go through this unit, there is what you'd expect you to be able to demonstrate, and some of the outcomes that you'd be expected to get from this unit, that you should be, by the end of this unit, you should be able to describe what a social policy is and what do we mean by welfare. Because you'd find, as we'll get into the unit, you find that social policy connotes it's the bias of social policy is towards welfare, improving people's lives. And we'll be looking at what do we mean by social policy and how does it relate to what we mean by welfare, and what is welfare to begin with. Essentially, you should be able to describe then what social policy is and how is it related with welfare and what welfare itself is in essence. Then you should also be able, once you have gone through this unit, should be able to discuss the decision-making process within the context of coming up with a social policy and implementing or administration of this social policy. And when it comes to the decision-making process, is that you'd find when you are coming up with a social policy, you have different stakeholders that are involved in the process of coming up with a social policy. You have different levels of involvement or engagement. You have different decision-making points through the whole process of coming up with a social policy. And so we'll be looking at then how do you make these different decision points that are required in the context of the social policy, or even in the context of administration. When you're implementing this social policy, how do you make decisions? And we have different models that have been tested and proven to work that you can be able to use when coming up with a social policy, that you can also be able to use when coming to making up decisions or making decisions when it comes to administration of the social policy that are already in place. And within these decision-making process models, we also have decision-making tools that also you can use. You find that you can choose a model that you might want to use to make a decision. But within that model, then you also have different tools that you can be able to employ when making some of the decisions that need to be made in the administration or in the formulation of the social policy. The other thing that you should be able also to achieve, or you should be able to demonstrate by the end of, after going through this unit, you should be able to explain factors that influence social policy and administration. Because you'd find that a social policy itself is a reflective of the context within which it has been developed, or it's more of a reflective of that specific context. And the reason why it's a reflection of that context is because the factors that are existing within that context frame the nature, the scope, and the design of the social policy that then you come up with within that specific context. And in the same case also applies with the administration. The social policy that you come up with and how then it is going to be administrated, or how it's going to be implemented or overseen by the individuals who are going to be responsible for its implementation equally is going to be a reflective of the context within which it's going to be employed or applied, that specific policy. And so then we would want to look at what are some of these factors, what are these contextual factors that shapes, informs the design and the implementation of a social policy. Because you find a social policy that probably, if you have a social policy, say probably here in Kenya, and it seeks to address, say, for example, what you have, the elderly, the people that are elderly. Now, you'd find that what we have, the social policy that exists in Kenya might be a bit different from social policy that we have in Uganda. In as much as we only share a border, you might find that they are a little bit different in their context, in their formulation, and in their design, essentially. And you would also find that the mode of implementing some of these policies, or the administration of these policies, is also equally different, but it's only different because of the context. And these contexts are a result of factors that exist within those specific areas where the policy is developed or implemented. And so then the unit will be able to help you eventually be able to explain some of these factors, both of policy and of the administration. Another thing that you should also be able to demonstrate by the end of this session is that you should be able to discuss the role of social policy in social development work. Why would you need a social policy? To advance a social need, or to promote a social need, and how are they related, and what then role does the social policy in that context play? Then you also be able to analyze the connections and the relations of social welfare, and social policy. How does welfare and social policy relate? How are they related? And how do they complement or supplement each other? Then lastly, after going through this unit, you should be able to analyze the mechanics of social policy and advise changes, if need be, in policy design, implementation, and processes. And in the event that then we have in the contexts where we don't know, where there's no social policy that is in existence, then after going through this unit, you should be able to inform. One, you should be able to analyze the situation or the problem that exists within a specific society, and then be able to recommend or even assist in designing a policy, a social policy that can be able to that can be used to address the concerns that you have been able to identify within that specific society. So then, for us to be able to achieve the learning objective of this unit, and even be able to also to achieve the learning outcomes that have been outlined, this unit is divided into 14 sessions in which it is delivered. And these sessions are read out or they are in the conventional learning environment. That's when we are here in school, in university, is that you'd have these sessions as lectures that you'd have every week for a span of 14 weeks, and each lecture or session going for 3 hours. And what I want us to take us through is then what lesson would we be covering for those 14 sessions. And the first one that we'll be looking at is that we'll be looking at introducing ourselves into this unit. And this is basically getting an understanding of, one, being able to familiarizing ourselves with the basic terms that are used. That is the definition of the terms that are used and that will keep on cropping up in the course of this unit, when we'll be covering this unit. Then we'll also be looking at things to do with defining social policy, social administration, things to do with social welfare or welfare itself. We'll also be looking at things to do with decision making. We also look at the administration and management because we like we said, this is a key component within social policy. And then we also be looking at the subject matter of social policy and administration. And we also be looking at the history of development of social policy, the evolution, the historical context, and why we still have it in process, and why we still need it in the current setting. We're looking at, because we have not always had social policies since time immemorial. While else it is possible that we have had, that human beings have always been concerned of taking care of the disadvantaged individuals within their environs or within their societies, is that we have not always have it as a written code that a society should have to follow to conduct itself towards taking care of the disadvantaged within societies. But then we do have a history of at what point that then this social policy came into, became a formal legislation that a nation or a society can aim to registrate, enact, and then commit itself to follow it through. And then you look, because when this whole process started, what we had, say for example, what we had in terms of social policy in the 18th century, in the 19th century, is not what necessarily we have presently, but we have a lot of evolution and changes that have taken place in what a social policy should be, and how it should, and what it should look like, and what areas it should focus, and who are supposed to be the individuals who should benefit from those social policies, or who are supposed to be the target individuals or sectors of society for social policy. Then next, what we also be looking at is the question of policy making. like we said, this is social policy is about policy, and in the event, in some circumstances when there is no policy that is existing, then there is always a question. There's always a question or a need of, can we just develop one? And so this unit will seek to take you through the process of coming up with a policy. And a policy, be it public policy, be it social policy, be it development policy, all of them, and especially if they're public policies, is that they have a standard process that they normally follow. And within this process that you have to follow when you're coming up with a policy, is that you also have different stakeholders that are involved, and you have different stages that's supposed to go through before it is adopted as being a ratified national contract that the nation should commit itself to pursuing. And so we'll be looking at the processes of policy making. We'll also be looking at the stakeholders or the parties that are involved when coming up with a social policy in that context. Then we also be looking at some of the factors that influence policy making, and especially in the context of coming up with a social policy. What sort of factors would you expect, either that inhibit or that promote the adoption or the development or the framing of a social policy within different contexts? Then lastly, we also be looking at some of the challenges that you should expect to face when you're coming up, or when you're trying to come up with a social policy. Then the other thing that we also look at is we also look at the models of social policy. And we have different models of social policy. We have what we refer to as the industrial achievement performance model of a social policy. We have what we refer to as institutional or redistributive model of social policy. We also have what we call the residual welfare model, and we also have what we call the solidarity model of social policy. And all of these models, they are different in terms of their focus, in terms of their nature, in terms of who it identifies as a specific persons that should benefit from that specific policy, social policy that you have come up, that have been developed. And you'll be looking at them in the course of these sessions. The other thing that we also be looking at is the question of decision making. And in this case, like we have discussed, is that when coming up with a policy, when coming up with social policy, it involves several different stakeholders. It involves different individuals and different partners that would have interests or might want to influence the sort of policy that you end up coming up with, because in one way or another, they're going to be affected, or they're going to take advantage of it for whatever reason. And so we'll be looking at some of the model that exists when it comes to making decisions. We also be looking at the types of decisions that you can be able to make when it comes to social policy and administration. We also be looking at different models that exist that you can be able to employ, and the tools, and this one we have already discussed, and also be looking at the challenges that you expect to encounter when you are coming up with challenges that you expect to experience when you're coming up with a decision, when you're making up a decision, either about the policy, about its administration, or about its implementation, or about its delivery, in essence. Then in session 7 and session 8, we'll be looking at social policy administration in entirety. And in this case, you'll be looking at the administrative processes and the tasks involved in the administrative process of a social policy. Then we'll also be looking at the stakeholders in social policy formulation and administration. And when it comes to stakeholders, you'd find here we'll be looking at things to do with one, the involvement of the target beneficiaries or the target personnel's the target beneficiary for that specific social policy. You also be looking at the government agencies that are going to be involved in not only the formulation, but also might also be involved in the implementation of that specific policy. You might also want to involve things to do with the local leadership, where the policy that is intended to be implemented, or the people that would be expected to be involved in rolling out or implementing the social policy, being also involved in the development and the formulation of the policy. You might also want to, you also find the other interested parties. This one could be either international organizations that have their main focus within supporting human welfare or improving welfare, and you also find maybe non-governmental organizations that also have interest in that area. You will also find maybe the private sector, which one way or another also plays an important role when it comes to implementation or the realization of the objectives of a social policy that has already been developed or that is in the process of being developed. You might want to also to get their input in that regard. The other thing that also we'll be looking at, and those are the different stakeholders that we will also be looking at dissecting through and be able to identify what sort of stakeholders do you expect when you're coming up with a social policy, and at what point do you have to involve them, because you'll find that you don't have to involve all of them from the very start all the way through the whole process of formulation of a social policy or even the administration of a social policy. But it's at different points when their inputs or their participation is of importance, is of essence. But then not only identifying the stakeholders, then it's a question of being able to know at what point do you involve them, in what sort of policy, what kind of policy. And these stakeholders, the kind of stakeholders also will also be the type of stakeholders that you have in the process of coming up with the social policy will also be affected by the nature of the social policy that you're coming up with, things to do with the focus of that social policy and the scope of the social policy. Because if you're coming up with a policy that only focuses in one region, say maybe only in one county, then the stakeholders that you're going to have involved in the process of coming up with that policy will be mostly constricted within that specific county, essentially. But if you're coming up with a policy, social policy, that has its scope at the national level, then you'll have individuals, then you'd have the national government itself involved, the various ministries involved at the national level, and then you have representatives from all the counties, then you have representatives from all different players at the national level being involved in the formulation of that specific social policy that you're pursuing. And so we'll be looking at that specific component. Then you'll also be looking at the factors that influence administration of social policy. Then you'll also be looking at the factors that influence administration of social policy, and also looking at the challenges that hinder the administration of social policy. Because regardless of what a good policy that you come up with, one, like we said, when looking at the factors, is that one, the end product of the social policy that you come up with is a reflection of the factors that exist within the context within which it has been developed. But then, regardless of how a good policy that you have been able to come up with, there's always the challenge that when you're implementing it, you will be expected to face some challenges when it comes to administration of that specific policy. And in this unit, then you seek to identify, to highlight, and to discuss some of the challenges that the administration of social policy faces. Then next, we will be looking at social welfare services. And in this case, we'll be looking at the different types of social welfare services that exist. We'll also be looking at the stakeholders that are involved and their roles in the administration of social welfare services. And we'll also be looking at the roles of social policy in social development. Like we said, when it comes to social policy, in itself, in its nature, it seeks to advance welfare, the welfare of the individuals within a society. And then in this case, then in section 9 and in section 10, we'll give more emphasis towards looking at welfare and social services, so social welfare services provision, because this in itself is the element of the implementation of the social policy as designed. Then next, we will be looking at the management in social policy administration. And in this case, you'll be looking at the management of resources that have been provided for the implementation of social policy. We'll also be looking at the personnel management, and we'll also be looking at the physical management. One thing that you realize, and as we'll be looking at the different types of social policies that exist, their models and even their formulation and implementation, is that you do have some social policies that only focuses on supplying the needs, the basic needs that maybe certain specific groups of individuals within a society might be needing or might need. And in that case, then you'd have these resources that are coming either from the government or from the development partners or from donors or from institutions that are coming in, and all of them are supposed to be directed towards the target individuals that are supposed to benefit from that specific from those specific resources. And in that regard, you'd have to require to look at then how are you supposed to administrate or manage those resources, make sure that none of them gets misused or lost. Then you also have individuals. When it comes to administration or the management of social policy administration, is that you have a myriad of personnel that are normally employed or involved in coming up, in implementing or carrying out a social policy. And in this case, you might look at say, for example, if the social policy is about taking care of the vulnerable, maybe the most poor, or maybe the very old, you'd have what you call, in terms of personnel, you'd have those people who you normally go to the field, going to evaluate these households that are supposed to benefit from the social programs that have been conducted, maybe things to do with going to find out how these individuals are doing at a personal level, and why they qualify, and how are they faring, maybe compared to when they entered the program before they joined the program, and some of those other factors that might be influencing and changing at the household level. And so we have married a very many number of individuals that are normally employed when it comes to implementation of a social or administration of a social policy, essentially. Then you have fiscal management in the event that then what the involvement is more of providing funding or finances to this sector of society that are being supported by the social policy. Then the question of fiscal management then also becomes an important area that we also be looking at. Then next, we'll be looking at social dimensions of delivering social services, and in this case, we'll be looking at the manner of delivery and the obstacles that inhibit service delivery, and we'll also be looking at the emerging trends in social policy and administration. Then, lastly, we'll be looking at the case studies of social policy and administration that exist within Europe. We will also be looking at the North America. In this case, maybe looking at Canada and USA. We will also be trying to look at the social policy and administration that exists within the Asian countries, and especially mostly looking at Japan and South Korea, and also looking at what we have in our context in Africa. That is maybe in Kenya. And also looking at other developing countries, trying to see what sort of social policy do they have, and then how are those policies maybe formulated? How are they developed? What were the contexts within which these policies were developed, and how did that context influence the nature of the social policy that they have currently being implemented? How have those policies been implemented in terms of management of resources, in terms of having the personnel, the management, the personnel management, things to do with the physical management, things to do with the stakeholders that have been involved in the formulation and the administration of all these policies. So, and these are the things that we'll be looking at and trying to compare between these nations and countries, trying to see what differences come out and what informs some of those differences. What sort of challenges have these policies implementation has it faced, and how has these nations been able to overcome some of those challenges, and then the differences, because you define maybe a social policy that exists in the Europe, maybe between two countries in Europe, maybe take for example maybe a country like Germany and maybe France. The social policy that exists between those countries, in as much as they might be distinct and different, they might be more similar than maybe a social policy that is maybe from France compared to the one that is in North America, maybe one country in North America, like maybe the US, then America, or even Canada. But also in that context, you might find that while else the two policies within maybe France and Germany might be similar than the policy of France and maybe the USA, you would find that maybe the social policy between France and USA are more similar than what you'd find a policy maybe that is in less developed countries, maybe like in Africa or in Kenya, essentially. And then we also be looking at some of those other emerging markets like South Korea, and how they have been able to address the question of coming up with social policies and implementation of those policies that they are coming up with. Then in the delivery of this unit is delivered or will be delivered through lectures like the one that we have in right now, and we'll also be having things to do with the group discussions. That's the assignment that is given to students during class and formed in groups that you do have to go and research, then come up with a presentation and make presentations in class. And then we'll also be looking at the case studies like I have just highlighted, looking at different social policies that exist in different contexts and trying to understand them within their contexts and seeing then how those contexts and those policies would be reflective in the event that we were to have those policies implemented or even developed within our own context, and what sort of factors exist within our own environments that would shape the sort of social policies that we come up with. And even within Kenya, we also do have social policies that already exist, and we also be looking at them and trying to see how have they been framed, and what is their nature, what's their focus, and trying to understand why they are the way they are, and trying to see where there exist opportunities where they can be improved, or gaps where other policies that can be developed, and what your input might be in that regard. Then we also be looking at the assessment for this unit. In this case, the assessment for this unit would include things to do with the assignment. You'll be given an assignment that you're supposed to carry out, and then you also be having a continuous assessment test. And for both the assignment and the continuous assessment test, this one will earn you 30% of the marks, and then you would also be having a final exam or the end of semester exam, which should give you 70%. The pass mark for this unit is 40%, but you should always aim to score higher. Now we have several books that are recommended that you can be able to refer to for you to help you to understand further or better about social policy and administration, and this includes the proceedings of the National Workshop on Poverty and Policy in Kenya. This one was done by Mariara. Then you can also go through the Migration and Social Integration and Crime, a cross-national approach, that is by Solivetti. And then another book by William, that's on economic analysis of public policy. And you can also look at the book by Jared on the Handbook of Public Policy Analysis, Theory, Politics, and Methods. And lastly, the book by Ron on Analyzing Public Discourse Analysis in the Making of Public Policies. And you have many more other books in the library that you can also be able to look at when it comes to social policy and administration that you can also be able to refer to. And that is the end of our session. Thank you.
These televised lectures supplement our robust online learning going on our MKU online platform. You can view more on our televised lectures via our online platform. We are in a digital era, and Mount Kenya University knows this. The following are the steps to follow so as to complete your online application. Download the application form from the website www.mku.ac.ke. Attach copies of your academic certificates and ID. Pay the application fees via M-Pesa pay bill number 270988. Your ID is the account number. 2,000 shillings is the charge for a postgraduate. You can also deposit in the bank accounts provided on the website. Then email all the above to apply@mku.ac.ke.